Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Noam Segal, and on behalf of Stephen Medoff, the chair of the MA in Curatorial Practice at the School of Visual Arts in New York, I'm glad to welcome you to the online event, The Algorithmic State, Digital Repair with Kader Attia. Just a few details before I introduce Kader. So during today's event, Kader and me will talk for about 50 minutes, and after which we'll open to Q&A. As you can see, there is a Q&A box down here, and you can feel free to drop your questions, which I will read some of them at the end. The entire event is recorded and will take up to an hour. And it is a huge pleasure for me to have Kader joining me here. Kader Attia is an award-winning artist and a cultural practitioner. In 2016, he founded La Colonie, a discursive space in Paris. And in the same year, he was recognized with the Marcel Duchamp Prize in Paris, followed in 2017 by the prize of the Miro Foundation in Barcelona and the Young Queen Art Prize in Seoul. He was the artistic director of the 2022 Berlin Biennial, the artistic director of the 2022 Berlin Biennial, still present, which I had the pleasure of joining as one of the team members. So Kader, thank you so much. And so, you know, we started talking about digital repair already a few, let's say a year ago, maybe. So before I'm going to embark on my first question, I just wanted to give a small framework for our discussion to what is repair when we think about the human and the digital. So when we think very naturally kind of like about ways of repair, human repair, we can think that if I, for example, will hurt Kader, and Kader will feel hurt, he will tell me, and then it's like a feedback loop. It's a feedback system, right? And then I will correct my ways, and on my next movement, I will treat Kader differently, right? I'm going to self-correct myself. AI has a very similar system in the sense that it's also self-correct, right? It supplements changes, and because of the way of data scribing, of course, it's constantly self-correcting. However, as we're human are mostly calibrated on, let's say, moral values and ethics, most of AI repair, right, the code is mainly calibrated on ways of wealth accumulation and profit making. So it's not exactly geared towards the same objectives, right? And this is where I want to jump into this discussion. And maybe we can start by, Kader, maybe you can define repair for us according to your understanding and practice, the way it played out in your practice as a form of an energy, agency, a process, and on and on. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Noam, and welcome to everyone. I'm just putting my phone in plane mode so that we won't be disturbed by algorithm, why will be, those kind of alerts that we all know. So welcome to everyone, and I really like this starting point because basically the question of repair, particularly in the way I've been exploring it the last almost 15 years now, probably even before, because I started before Documenta of 2012. So I started around 2005, these researches, is that most of the time we take for granted, particularly through my practice, that repair is sort of embedded into the past. I mean, I've been very much looking or caring about processes of repair in pre-modern societies that have been colonized. And therefore, everything starts, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, with a sort of analogies I have made when I was observing that, but very slowly discovering that pre-modern societies, particularly in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, were actually using the arena of repairing, of fixing an object, not, I mean, the same way that modern Western societies have been setting as the idea of repair for centuries now. So I can also just show you a few examples, for instance, to start with. So the first, let's say, I mean, the fascination I got for that started for the repair, like this, actually, this is a tool actually to lie your neck on the wall, because the Luba people used to have incredible hairdress, and to protect these incredible shapes, they used to sleep not with a pillow, but not on a pillow, but on this kind of neck shells, or I don't know how to call it. What is fascinating is that we can, if we look carefully here in the middle of the object, I mean, we can, I can see, I don't know if you can, but we can see the crack here of the broken object. We can see the fault here, okay? And actually the knot that have been made with this probably copper string are mimicking the shape of the whole object. They are like particularly this one, as you can see, is actually mimicking this sort of beautiful design. I think the question of the repair here means that the repair, I mean, deliberately is a moment to show the injury. And from this observation I made, like again around 20 years ago, I started to look at other objects. You have the same here. This is the top of a mask from the Ibibio in Nigeria, and as you can see also the way that the string is crossed here and here, so which is supposed to fix this broken part of the mask at the top of the mask, is actually mimicking also the crosses that have been etched on the surface of the wood. You can see many of the process of many of repairs are like mimicking, but also sometimes just ethically fixing the object, you know. But what interests me definitely is why the repair has become the ground for a new aesthetic of the object, like what we would have thrown away within our consumerist modern society, or pre-modern society. Why pre-modern society were actually caring so much about the object that they have given that their object broken or injured, that they have given them a new life. And I think this came so clear to my mind where I got this. This is another calabash from Ethiopia, but let me show you this fabric from the Congo, from the Kuba people in Congo. I got this object basically by a friend from Congo Brazzaville, where I lived 4 years, Armand, who gave it to me when I left. It's a small 1 meter on 1 meter 80 long raffia fabric with embroidery. Typical from the Kuba people. He used to belong to his aunt, and he knew that I was very interested by art and culture. He was not an artist himself. He was actually a mechanic, but we became friends because when I was living there, of course I was living with the Congolese, not with the French or the white people who were very boring, except a few of them. So I kept this object for years, almost 4 years. And one day, I mean, I was always fascinated by the inclusion of this French Vichy fabric on top. I mean, stitched on this raffia embroidery. I mean, definitely colonial fabric, you know, either Vichy or Pied de Poule. I'm not an expert of textile, but it's definitely French, into this raffia with the same care. That is very important. If you look around the stitch, the stitch has not been included without respect. So for me, it was a decoration. But actually, I was wrong. One day when I turned this object, because I was moving from my old place, I discovered that behind each piece of this French fabric stitched, there was a hole probably created by, I don't know, a mouse or an insect, but they were aesthetical repair, or they were clearly repairs, but the aim of the person who did it was also to aesthetically signify something, to really like create this sort of double action between ethic and aesthetic. And for me, I mean, this was really a moment where I started to think that there was something that all the field of research of Western anthropology have completely missed, is that most of the objects that were repaired and kept in collection in the West, even in the US, because now we are speaking in the US, but I visited the reserve of the African Art Museum of the Smithsonian in Washington, DC, and I was looking in the database on repaired object from non-Western cultures, and there was not any, there was not such categories. So the way that the Western epistemology have completely neglected I would say these, I would say part of engineering the ethic of repairing on non-Western society, pre-modern or not, for me was very concerning, because from this, I then pull out the thread of, because of the Western conception of repair, which was and still is the contrary, means that when an object or a body has been injured, the main aim of the surgeon, for instance, as you know, I've been working a lot with surgeons also, is to actually erase the injury. But let's go back to object, and let's go back to this very important conception, because we will bind this after to digital governance. Repair in the West, that is more or less based on the same Latin word, reparare, so repair or reparatur in German, or réparation in French, or réparation in Spanish, etc., is actually based on a word that means returning at the original state. So reparare means returning at the original state. There are many meanings, but what is the core meaning of it is the notion of returning before the accident. So conceptually, when the modern mind has been celebrating the notion of repairing with this word, repair, is actually selling the capacity to control time, the capacity to control history. The fact that, for instance, and I know, I mean, as you know, I'm fascinated by object. I didn't want to make a long slideshow tonight, but I can tell you that, for instance, a friend in Berlin, Anna Goebbels, she's an incredible restorator, so conservator, and works for the biggest museum like Pergamon, etc. She's actually restoring ceramic for this museum, and her aim is to erase the visibility of any injury when the object have been broken and brought to her. So we are still in this logic that the power of a repair in the Western sort of gaze and imagination is to be able to return the object at its original state before the accident, which is a total myth that I've named the myth of the perfect. So, of course, with neoliberal capitalism and consumerist society, we went beyond this, because for everyday life object now, we do not even fix them, we buy new ones. So for me, there's something here in terms of agency of let's say, if we do polarize a little bit, we dare to polarize pre-modern moment and post-modern moment, I mean modern moment, and hold the successive modernity that have succeeded until today. We have two ways of dealing with repair. On the one hand, the repair aim at keeping the injury visible. I can give you thousands of examples. The kintsugi from the Japanese people, the calabashes in Africa stitched with staples, the nkisi from Congo that you just have in front of you, very high, but also this, which is also an interesting object, because this is a total mise en abîme. It's actually a colonial helmet sculpted in wood, but that has been also repaired. So Another form of repair is what I call mimesis, the way that using the position from where you are, in that case, you have been occupied and colonized. I'm sure you heard about the Brazilian poet de Andrade, Oswald de Andrade, who said, "You eat your enemies to vomit it again." So cultural anthropophagia. You have here this typical example of how mimesis, I have another one, like this whiskey bottles that is actually has been actually used as a fetish, as a kissy sculpture, because of the hole you have in the middle with a couple of teeth. The hole was has always been in that kind of kissy, the place where the magical mixture was installed. So I was telling you that on the one hand, you have plenty of examples of repair which are simply fixing an object that has been broken. And on the other hand, you have this interesting mimicry that, for me, echoes this notion of Oswald de Andrade of cultural anthropophagia, you know. So I can skip and come back to this later if you want. Okay.
Yes, I think it's for sure we'll go back to this later because we'll talk about those kind of formations. Okay, that's fascinating. So I'll try to pick it up from here. We discussed a little bit about Hugh Kui's philosophy, and I know it was kind of like central to both of our thinking. And I was in a talk with him here last week in eFlex, and I shared with you that at some point he delineated the way that people are, let's say, manifested online, right? So a person is a dot, although a dot does never, right? It doesn't exist in reality. And another person will be a dot, and the online operations will allow us to stretch a line, which is also never existing in real life, between those two dots, right? So we're creating a network. This is one formation, right, that also goes against the idea of shared world building. That is a buzzword that is very common online today. However, we do know that historically speaking, we were never individuated in such ways. And also, if we were by ourselves, as Yukui said, we would be eaten by a tiger. But historically speaking, of course, we're always in groups. Now, I want to take this to La Colonie, of course, and talk about the way La Colonie served to liberate speech, right, and make room for genuine conversations. And in that sense, it was a relief from online culture, right? And at some point, I think in your interesting discussion at Text der Kunst, you mentioned Gilbert Simondon and the way he talked about the collective individual, right? That is a collective body that contains multiplicity of voices. However, online, what we have is actually the opposite. We have an individual that is based on a collective extraction. It's kind of like the same, just the opposite, right? So on one hand, again, just to reiterate, a collective body that is based on individuals, and here an individual that is based on collective extraction, but yet that identity is being pulled into our online identity, of course. And that way, let's say, shapes us up as masses because it takes away any individual or particular traits. So thinking about those two, let's say, fabrications or formations of community, right? Individual-based collectivity or collective-based on individuals, how can we think about assembly and gathering? And how can we delineate between those two and think about online gathering and if even if those are the right words or the right concepts to use?
Well, I mean, I think the question of finding the right words is crucial here, because I think that we are also living in the prehistory of algorithmic governance, and the technology in many ways, and also our perception and our way to understanding is in constant evolution. That we have to be careful, because Gilbert Simondon is a philosopher who was active in the 50s, and he was a philosopher of the technique in the continuation of this, I mean, he was not in the continuation. That's why it's fascinating. He really went into some things particular. And his conception of individuation, of collective individuation, has been used by Bernard Stiegler in his book, The Automate Society, to explain that Simondon was saying something that I always find funny, because as you know, I'm always on my bike. And one day I was like fed up, I wanted to buy a new one. And I don't know why, I use my bike to go to a huge mall in Berlin, incredible, where they sell bike, all the bikes and things. And when so I look at the price, they were expensive, etc. So I said, okay, I will think about it. I left, and when I looked at my bike when I left, when I found it again in the parking, I was very sad for him. It was like an animal. I mean, this is typical the way that I have individuated with my bike. It's like if you, I don't know if you have a cat or a dog, but the fact that you feel that if you are living at home and you will leave the cat for 15 days, you feel that the cat knows that. Maybe the cat might know because it's an animal. But I was thinking on my bike, I mean, it's incredible because you guys are individuating yourself through the bike. And this is what Simondon explained with the technique, that there is a concept used by Bernard Stiegler called, I'm sorry to use the French word here, I'm not familiar with the English term, it's called milieu associé, so associated fields. It is inspired by the Gamble power plant, which was a power plant, a very modern power plant that was working with the, the rise of the sea. So basically the rise of the sea every day, was actually cooling the motor, but at the same time, because of the pressure, making them running. It's a kind of incredible engineered power plant project. And so the role played by the sea here is the milieu associé. So basically the individuation is actually the encounter between one entity and another one, and together they produces a third individual at some point. What happens with digital governance, and Stiegler nailed it very well in his book, is that because we are living in a society of information where everything we are doing is actually collected, we live in a society, in a reticular society. So speaking, writing, using the keyboard, whatever, everything is actually inscribed. And the collect of data works because of this handless writing process that happens in so many ways. Like I tell you, just speaking, you have also the fact that you put online your photo on Facebook, etc. That is also part of another aspect that we will speak later on about what Michel Foucault called hypomnematas. But what is important to understand is that my impression is that even though references to Simondon bring us back to the very technique or technicity of the individuation, we kind of lack of word and concept to understand the complexity of how we are individuating, how this individuation actually works, or maybe more like Stiegler, is actually bypassed by algorithmic governance, because what Stiegler developed or understand as collective individuation is basically what we are doing, you and I and our audience right now. We are exchanging ideas, and because of this handless back and forth of ideas, of argumentation, or of anything, we are trans-individualize ourselves all together to a collective individual that is like floating on top of us. The computational governance or the algorithmic governance, because also it is driven by capitalist priorities, is actually bypassing this process of trans-individuation by stimulating the subject at an impulsive level, so that you don't have this conscious interaction that we do have, that we actually share. And that's why, for me, the only answer I can give you regarding my fear and my skepticism about the lack of correct vocabulary to actually map the situation we are living today with the shift of civilization from pre-digital to digital is probably psychology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry. I really found in many, in a little bit in Stigler, but in many other thinkers like Catherine Malabou, for instance, in Frantz Fanon a lot, because I think Fanon has understood perfectly, I mean, with the school of Kostos-Keles, that mental health is above all linked to the environment. There's no such unique, let's say, biological, in French we call substrat, I mean, origin of mental illness. It's always linked to the environment. There's always a sort of correlation between the environment, whatever it is, digital, political, cultural, family, whatever, and the self. And that's why, for me, I'm very interested by this, because I think the critique of and we see it, I mean, the anxiety produced by computational governance, etc., we are attending it.
Yeah, we definitely see it every day. And just to even support what you said, there was an article last week with Jérôme Lanier, who's another web philosopher and a quantum artist, and he said that the main fear is that it's just going to lead to mass insanity, which and it's also interesting to think about how the term environment kind of expanded into something. Okay, thank you, Kader, for this. I'm going to jump to my next question. So before we continue with repair, I want to try to delineate a little bit the digital object that is different than the ethnographic object, right? So, for example, in the interview from 2021 with Nina Muntaman at Textkunst, you mentioned that the ethnographic collection of the Vatican, this is one of my favorite parts, that the collection was actually cared for by many art practitioners with different functions, of course, curators, conservators, and on, throughout the years. And you mentioned that the objects are actually collecting us, right? And not the opposite way. And I find it fascinating also when thinking about AI, right? You said, because those objects are also watching us and listening to us, they need to be part of this conversation, right? The conversation about reinstitution. And this can be said as well about AI. However, unlike ethnographic objects that you described that are witnessing us, right? AI objects are working with what they witness, right? So they're doing something with what they listen to and what they watch. They do different things, like different operation. They turn it into data, they taxonomize, they analyze, they capitalize, and on and on. So, and this is really from like a philosophical standpoint. I want to hear your thoughts about that, and if you can kind of like sketch those differences in the modes of happenings. Let's say, what kind of actions those object types do in different ways. So again, like the ethnographic objects that is kind of like collecting us, and the AI object that is also collecting us, but in a very, very different way.
Yeah, no, you're right. I was like, I was referring to the object of the Vatican collection, but I could refer to many objects. I remember that, I mean, talking about archaeology, or I mean, the obsession of the modern mind to collect, gather in a huge institution, any object that is part of the past, and really like, I mean, protecting it, any price, is for me something that always fascinated me, this obsession of collecting, because there's definitely, or neurotically, if I may to say so, a sort of, there is a Sisyphus aspect of this. We do collect for what? So many collectors I heard that were selling their collection because they found their children actually were, I mean, not only dislike the collection, but were hungry against the collection, because they had the feeling that the collector has spent most of his love for the object, and not for the family. There are many stories like that. So for me, the question of collecting is super ambivalent. It's both beautiful, but it's also very dark. And I think that this idea that we are obsessed for collecting is also linked to what I was saying before, how, I mean, the way that the West has celebrated the notion of Reaper has a control of time, has a control to freeze time, actually, which I think is one of the biggest Promethean fantasy of modernity, control time. And that you can see, for instance, today with cosmetic industry, on terms of aging, etc. That are linked also to the Reaper and surgery. But what I found interesting is that if we mirror the fact that we look at the object, and within, let's say, just a century, at Musée de l'Homme or at the Vatican, for instance, there were indeed so many conservators and curators who have been working with this object and have passed away and have left the place to younger who began also old and have been retired, etc. It's clear that we do believe that we are collecting the object, but in the end, it's the contrary that is happening. The object are collecting us, and we have not started the work on that. That's why I think it's important to mention it. Now, I think that if we mirror this process of the object are watching us, they're not only collecting us, but they are watching us passing, which is very interesting. Algorithm, particularly what we call algorithm double, that are like reproduction of or copy of ourselves, of our, what define the predictions on us to improve this extraction of wealth by consumerism, either, I mean, that is happening online through the sale of all the behaviors data of each individual on market of attention, for instance. This is like the classic. For me, they are working a total different way, because there is, I would say, a biased relation between the human being self and the AI, in the sense that how to explain? I think it's a question of understanding again whether AI are repairing or not. The repair I was talking about before have to do with the ontology of the self. It's actually a self using technique to fix something. So it's definitely a relation between a self and the object. So a subject and the object, and everything is based on relation. This correlation defines the understanding of the object, but it does not say that the object is alive, is clever enough to think is an object.
This can be said about AI too, though.
That's, I mean, I think the limit that we have reached today, because if you are following very much the news, I mean, yeah, every day we hear about someone who has decided to give up the research on AI because an AI started to talk to him in a very emotional way. So, and you heard, I mean, we all heard what has happened recently. They have also said that we need to find a pause. We need to find the key pause for at least 6 months, which I think is bizarre, which I think there's something, you know, but
yeah, maybe I'll just mention to the audience.
Let's come back on emotion also, because I think it's something I would like to tell you about, because I think it's one of the most fascinating things in this question. But if you want, for me, the difference between the poetry of imagining this object watching us and watching today, attending the moment of the huge, incredible debate on restitution of those objects that have been spoiled during colonial time, for me, is part of a narrative that actually not only poetically, and plays as a mirror of the ethic of the human subject, because these objects are watching us, but at the same time they are also the silent mirrors of the crime that have been committed. Like Jürgen Zimmerer always told me, the German historian, that most of the debate on restitution are very much on the object and we have to give them back, or how we took them. But I mean, there have been people killed to take these objects. There have been murder, there have been massacres. So there is a whole narrative that these objects incarnate at some point, but that is untold because of the hegemony, of the hegemonical discourse of the so-called winner who write the history. And we are living this moment where there is a kind of sort of need to unlearn from this narrative and rebuild a new narrative. And that's why, for me, understanding that the objects are watching us, called a relation between us and them. With artificial intelligence, unfortunately, I say artificial, the artifice of the ontological subject, that is the AI, is actually moving away from us because of technological capacity. It's already faster, smarter, I'm sure. And the next step, this is what I wanted to tell you, Noam, and to all of our friends here, is the emotion, the capacity for AI to emphasize emotion. Because, and we know that most of the, facial recognition in China, for instance, we invited this fantastic scholar in the symposium who spoke about that. The core stake of the future of AI is how we can basically understand, how AI can understand really cognitively at a level of intuition, the emotion. How we can give to the AI the intuition of emotion. For me, it's really like super interesting to definitely care about this aspect, because because it sounds like it's a kind of paradox. On the one hand, it makes AI very close to us, and on the other hand, moving so fast away from us.
Also brings up the question of how you can code intuition, which is almost I just want to mention about what you mentioned earlier, that you referred to the letter provided by an institute called The Future of Life, which is a conglomeration of a number of different research institutes, with the exception of Sam Altman from OpenAI. All the other big corporations that develop AI today ask to pause the development of other AI tools for 6 months. So, okay, I'm going to continue with the thread of reinstitution. And I remember when on the same interview, you commented on the French proposal to return the Benin bronze, right? And if I remember correctly, you talked about Macron, and Macron came up with this big grandiose proposal that also reflects care and offers to send back the objects, as you said, in a way that does not necessarily include the acts that surrounding the act of course, removing them from their original environments. But then you mentioned that this act is actually pretty authoritarian in the sense that it's male, it's patriarchal, it speaks about care, but it actually has a political strategy. Now, I wonder, again, when we project that about AI repair, it seems that repair of algorithms that we have now, from question of bias up to question of the way they deal with small data, let's say, right? Programmers and designers are not necessarily the most capable professionals to answer those questions, since their profession does not develop those questions at any point. So we do understand that AI repair has to include some sort of a consortium or other group of people, particularly marginalized or unprotected groups in society, to give feedback or maybe even audit the actions of those algorithms. So coming back to our question again, I wonder what you think of that in relation to what you said, that people has to be part of that council of repair. You said that the people of the countries that have been stripped down of their artifacts needs to be part of this process, how to reinstitute those objects. So if we think about repair, what are the ways audience can be pulled into this narrative according to, you know, your understanding? And can we think about it in ways that are similar to repair, and what kind of inclusive systems of feedback we can imagine, if any?
Well, I mean, for me, of course, we can easily find a mirror in, I mean, many questions linked to colonialism with algorithmic governance. But we have to be very either precise and not, I would say, teleologically, you know, doing it, not targeting only the effect that we want to get, but trying to work much more with a genealogical comparison. For instance, the question of restitution, for me, is actually one of the most complex when it comes to mirroring it with artificial intelligence, because even the vocabulary is difficult. I don't know if you know, but collecting data is actually named restituting.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So everything we do is actually reproduced online on our algorithm double. The process is called restitution. So the algorithm restitute these data, you know, these codes, and then we can speak about you know, the dots, etc., the dots metaphor. But what is important to understand, rather, I would say that there are two things here. I think the stake incarnated by the debate on restitution today, right now, like Phil Winsar explained to me, is not anymore to know whether this object that has been stolen has to return. This is for clear. Is rather from the continent, in the case of African object, what kind of new experience we can invent to don't get into the Western modern trap of the museography with the AC vitrines, etc. I'm really here quoting Phil Winsar in a conversation we had, who has influenced me a lot on organizing different meetings about restitution. The real stake is what kind of new experience we can invent. Basically, what kind of how we can go beyond these sort of you know, mimicry that most of the society are actually trapped into, you know, with mimicry with coloniality. So I think that the case of the only thing that echoes significantly in my mind, though, maybe I'm not going to answer properly to your question, but what I will say can help to understand why we are talking, you and I, about this relation. I do believe that, like Shoshana Zuboff explained in Surveillance Capitalism, that the parallel between the Google discovery of new algorithms, such as the UPI, user profile information, which actually in 2006 has been registered in 2006, have been actually the most sophisticated algorithm to collect behaviors data. I think that what has happened here is that these engineers have understood that they have discovered a huge handless land that no one's paid attention to it before. So the real question, which involves law, ethics, I mean, politics, economy, etc., is whether when you consider that like she said, arriving in the Caribbean, Christophe Colomb said, okay, open bar, there's no one living here. There were people living there. And even there were the whole massacres that have been perpetrated to population who didn't want to submit, to the colonizers, was also orchestrated. There's an example in our book, interesting, orchestrated with a letter from the king. They were reading the letter before invading the village and burning it. So in the name of the King of Spain, you have to acknowledge whatever priest and then submit yourself. And people were dying, but they were still reading the letter, etc. What we have to understand is that the question of restitution of the artifact and the question is actually linked for me to the blindness that that makes us a little bit, I would say, fool. Because we have not been actually trained to understand that this question is a stake and it should not work like that. And it's pretty much linked to the fact that sometimes we take capitalism as, something you cannot resist against, you cannot change, there's nothing better, And I think what is important in this question raised by Shoshana Zuboff is that for me, the continuation of colonialism is actually digital. The continuation of what algorithmic governance is doing is actually not only occupying areas that were already existed, but we just didn't pay attention of the capacity, of how they could have been monetized by the industry, etc. But also that ethically these areas have to be, protected and should not be let without any regulation to the most, the most neoliberal and violent capitalism. I'm not saying that all capitalism is colonial. I would say yes, it is, but I make a strong difference with particularly the violence of digital technology, because the speed of it is actually faster than bureaucracy, sometimes in collusion with it, and therefore constantly escaping the regulation. So the question of restitution of the artifact has been, like Sylvain Sankale, the Senegalese lawyer, is saying in my film I did, has been also both escaping this question of the right, because people, most of the time, even African, not all of them, but the majority took for granted that these objects were not important. I remember back in time myself that in beginning of 2000, when I was back from Congo, going back and forth between ethnographic museums, these topics was not absolutely spoken in contemporary art. It has, let's say, 6-7 years. I remember that there were few artists, probably, I don't know, David Ammons or Wilson, who were using masks and showing masks. There were other few artists, but it was not a topic, because I think, sorry to be long, but I think it's important to know, like Professor Adak from Ivory Coast told me, an anthropologist who ran a PhD at the University of Abidjan 4 years ago, he said, but Kader, I have only 6 students here. Or Sylvie Memelkassi, the director of the Museum of Civilization, she told me, until the debate on restitution started, we had only white people in the Museum of Ethnography of Abidjan as visitors here. So you see, I think sometimes we just miss, the crucial importance of an area of a topic, because the whole narrative of the so-called winner is actually invisibilizing this importance. And sorry for being long.
No, you're great. Also, it connects to what you said about the collective individual, of course, and how we're becoming individuated together through these kind of questions. Anyways, we don't have a lot of time. I want to encourage everyone to drop questions at the Q&A, but I'm not skipping my one before last question. So I want to ask you as a last question about temporality. As you mentioned in the past, a number of times, artworks are slowing down machines, right? They are slowing time for us. And in this sense, they take care of us. They take care of their beholder. This temporal dimension allows depth. And in this sense, it's the opposite of the digital dimension, right? That is calibrated on systematic and synthetic speed. And artwork may enable one moment of reflection, but then when we think about the digital object, you mentioned that it's like the Dorian gray mirror. And you said that this object, when you look at, a digital, it doesn't have to be a digital art object, right? It could be a digital object of different kinds, but it makes you younger in the sense that temporalities oftentimes collapse. Also, in another off tangent of this, but very connected, is the ahistorical viewpoint as is being fostered by it, right? We're promoting unmoored visual languages, genealogies, and images, and they're becoming online, but then when we look at them, they're detached from their historical sources. So I was hoping you can talk a little bit about your image of the Dorian gray mirror and about online temporality.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for reminding me that Dorian Gray metaphor I did about AI, because I kind of forgot it, but I think it's still, I mean, it's not only enigmatic, it's also very precise, and it helped us to understand that there are definitely two, I mean, totally different temporalities between the real and the virtual technology. The fact that, or the virtual reality, the fact that, of course, that most of the data is collected on us are actually in the blockchain, inscribed forever. And the fact that we actually we are organic beings supposed to die. And again, maybe this is also the answer regarding the previous question about the object looking at us. We actually die, but actually the main, we all know that, fantasy of transhumanism today is that we can become trans and live online, as a digital subject. I think that in the Dorian Gray portrait, the portrait is getting older, right? And the guy is staying younger. In that case, we are the portrait, and the algorithm, the double algorithm, is getting older. But I would call here someone I like very much, the Lebanese writer Tarek El-Harith, who wrote Leaks and I mean different books, but particularly one on the Arab world. He wrote another book interesting on Arab Renaissance. But what I found interesting with Tarek is
Leaks and hawks in the Arab digital culture. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you, Noam. He will be very happy because I'm very bad to remember the title. But what I found interesting is the way he described actually the unconsciousness through this question of algorithmic double. Because of course we have WhatsApp, emails, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, so many things, emails, I mean, that are actually incarnating also a part of our unconsciousness. So for Tarek, which I found interesting, the unconsciousness today is also fragmented in the cloud. So it's like, for him, the fact that internet provide an incredible fragmentation of subjectivity by offering you everything you like. I mean, if you scroll any TikTok app, you have the algorithm giving you so many things that you have never thought about, and you like it because it's actually profiling you constantly. I mean, through all these data collected, but for the better and the worst. So that's why this question of unconsciousness fascinates me, because it's indeed a fragmented unconsciousness, that is that actually redefine on the ontology today. I mean, the self is not anymore this sort of individual centered subject that, like Rolando Vasquez said, enjoy the hubris of the 0 point from one subject looking at the world, but on the contrary, is the sort of panoptic process of a fragmented unconsciousness that is actually everywhere. And all these fragments of unconsciousness are actually, I mean, will stay forever. It's super weird. I'm sure you felt this one day. You look at Facebook or you received a message from the Facebook page of someone who passed away. It's very weird. And for me, this is a question of probably the I would say this is really like also this would, for me, is really the difference between the Reaper as I understood it through reality. I mean through the reality that we know, and the digital Reaper, again moved by this incredible capitalist machine that, like Jonathan Crary has explained very well in his 24/7 capitalism, is handless. So there is a kind of vertigo to imagine that even when you are not dead, it's still here. So not even when you are sleeping, when you will sleep forever, you will still be here. And I think this is a I don't want to be judgmental, you know. I think it's the only thing I can again bring as a tool to struggle or to deal with this significant shift in our civilization is, what does it mean psychologically? What does it mean in terms of considering that the individuation is also is collective, and a society to work needs interaction between different subjects through whatever protocol or moral, like you said, Habermas before, that the moral is a work that has been collective, basically, and not only one person imposing his or her moral, you know. I would love that in the future we actually find the intersection between technology, psychology, and arts, and other fields, to understand and to work on new tools, on new words, on a new vocabulary, to face the complexity of that we are just talking about. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm also like an object here. I'm watching what is passing.
Yeah, I really I highly agree that it requires a new set of terms and kind of like a new language to rethink older terms. Before I want to read one question from the chat, and just to say to everyone, we're not trying to say that algorithms are bad or good. They are neutral. There's a coder behind every algorithm. There could be a poor design or a well-designed, algorithmically well-designed platform. So this is kind of like the topic, and I want to ask one question. There are many thank you notes for you, Kader. But just to ask, what happens to interactions, the interpersonal and one-on-one existence, when it is primarily digitally mitigated?
Well, I mean, if we refer to what I was just saying about this fragmented unconsciousness that is like spread in the cloud, you know, there's not anymore one-to-one. They are, there to there, which it's also interesting because today in the queer debates, the redefinition of pronouns, you know, bring us also to use more and more the they. So, and that's my way also to understand queer. But for instance, feminism for me is a very interesting tool to also understand and probably rethink the society from the perspective, whether you are a man or not, a woman or something else. I think feminism is an extraordinary tool to understand the society. So it's interesting that I just came out now with this reference to Tarek's idea of an unconsciousness fragmented everywhere, you know, of bits of personality, because we are not a monolith consciousness. That's the thing. We are really there. That's the thing. It is the society that has made us. I have a book by Karima Lazali here, and also Rua Benjamin. I'm sure in the US you know her, The Race After Technology. The question of the name and the question of this sort of identity that is actually gathered and their pronoun or name is actually super questionable, and that's why probably the one-to-one is not anymore relevant, but the there-to-there. You see?
Mm-hmm. The there to there. Well, we're gonna have to finish with that. Kader, I want to thank you so much. It was fascinating, and I'm going to follow up with my questions. Thanks. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your thoughtful questions and comments. I will post a list of the books that we mentioned on the MACP website next to the video that will go online in about 48 to 72 hours. And yeah, and thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in the last event of Algorithmic State, where Stephen Madoff will converse with Lev Manovich. Thanks, Kader.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye to everyone. Ciao.